Good evening, everybody. My name is Mark Nutter. I'm the grants manager at New Hampshire Audubon. Just want to thank you so much for deciding to spend some time with us this evening at this workshop. And I'd first like to acknowledge that I'm talking to you near our state headquarters in Concord, New Hampshire, which is located within the site of the ancient village of Pennacook in Nadakina, which is the traditional ancestral homeland and waterways of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples past and present. I'd like to acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways and our ancestors, the Alnambak, or human beings, who have stewarded Nadakina throughout the generations for thousands of years. And I invite you to learn more about the indigenous presence on the land you occupy by visiting the website native-land.ca. Here you can see and click on territories of indigenous peoples and get connected to more educational resources. And for a more in-depth understanding of the Granite State, check out all the eye-opening resources at indigenousnh.com, including this particular story map, which details the history of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, specifically here in New Hampshire. These resources have really helped me recognize the ongoing consequences of colonialism for all people of color and the need for change in our current society. Thank you again for your interest in tonight's topic, which is exploring connections between the humanities and the natural sciences workshop with Dr. Maria Sanders. It's been a pleasure really of working with Maria since the very inception of this project back in December. And she currently serves as our humanities expert for this grant project. And as you know, this evening's talk is the second in our 12-month webinar speaker series called Exploring Connections. And before I hand it over to Maria, I'd like to take this opportunity to briefly describe how this webinar fits within the larger mission of New Hampshire Audubon. So you probably already know this, but New Hampshire Audubon is a state-based environmental nonprofit organization that's completely independent from National Audubon. We rely on members and donors like you to support our charitable mission, which has 4 pillars, the first of which being environmental education and connecting people to nature through experiences like school programs, nature day camp, and webinars like this. We also research and conserve species in peril, including large raptors and small birds. We manage about 10,000 acres of wildlife sanctuaries throughout the state for habitat and recreation. And finally, we advocate for sound environmental policy in the New Hampshire State Legislature. And I'm here today because of members and donors like you. We also have a huge network of over 2,000 volunteers that assist us with wildlife monitoring, ambassador animal care, environmental education, and wildlife sanctuary management throughout the state. If you are a volunteer, member, or supporter of New Hampshire Audubon, thank you. We couldn't do it without you. And if you'd like to become a part of our conservation family, please check out our website for ways to get involved. I'm excited to learn alongside you this evening from Maria and through our workshop. This will be an interactive session with some breakout rooms. So I'm looking forward to meeting and talking with a few folks one-on-one or in groups of 5 as we come to it. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sanders. Dr. Maria Sanders is a philosophy professor at Plymouth State University and licensed attorney, and has dedicated 3 decades to researching scientific variables for living full and flourishing lives, including the development of resilience and the exploration of how spaces become meaningful places. During the fall of 2019, Dr. Sanders traveled for 5 months to all 50 states in the US, filming interviews that documented people's experiences with place. As a public philosopher, she has written blogs, curated art exhibitions, hosted radio and television shows, and taught philosophy at the college level for over 30 years. Dr. Sanders' philosophy holds that intentionally selecting, creating, and protecting the physical environments within which we feel a natural affinity for is essential for living a full and flourishing life. The places where we live, work, and spend our leisure time must be a good fit for our health and well-being if we are to thrive in our existence. Just as the farmers care about the soil, water, and air around their crops in order to maximize excellent growth of those crops, caring about our natural environments provides an essential place for our physical, mental, and spiritual growth and well-being. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Sanders.
Thank you, Mark. If you could give me screen sharing privileges.
Yeah.
I do want to thank the New Hampshire Audubon Society and New Hampshire Humanities for making our program possible tonight. And I promise not to do a whole lot of talking. This is less of a talk and more of a workshop. So I think we'll probably all get a lot more out of it if we can hear from all the people who are attending tonight. But let me at least share my screen here for a little bit to set a framework for us. And there we go. Can everyone see that all right? Good deal.
Yep.
So what we're looking at is exploring these connections between the natural sciences and the humanities. It's kind of an interesting topic for me as a philosopher to look at, especially since if we go back in history far enough, the two really were one at one time with the natural philosophers. So let's take a little look at how we arrived at what is now kind of the common mindset in the 21st century, and perhaps one of the problems when it comes to presenting data that this current mindset is creating for both the humanities and the natural sciences. So I'll start really with how we tend to distinguish the two, and then we'll look at the similarities between them, or their similar history, I should say. So when we think about some of the distinctions, there are really two basic ways that the natural sciences and the humanities tend to be distinguished today. One has to do with the methods that are used with each of these categories of disciplines. With the natural sciences, we tend to associate those more with employing objective and empirical methods, whereas the humanities tend to use more subjective and rational methods. And also the subject matter. Obviously, as we just look at the names of each of these categories, it tends to already distinguish the primary subject matter they're focused on. So natural sciences tend to focus on the natural world, whereas the humanities tend to focus on the human being and the human world. But if we take just a quick little glance back in history, and here I'm going to use the Western philosophical timeline, since philosophy is my wheelhouse. We tend to identify Western philosophy as beginning around the 6th century BCE. Now, again, there were already some interesting things happening in what we would consider to be the Eastern Hemisphere at that time period. But Western philosophy, which is really the historical roots that we see in the United States, really gets identified early on with individuals like Thales and Anaximenes and Anaximander. These were all natural philosophers. And what that means is they were interested in really the very similar questions that our natural scientists are asking today. Now, that doesn't mean they were really scientists. In fact, we didn't really have that term science yet. What the natural philosophers were really focused on were questions like trying to explain what the natural world is comprised of, how it came into existence, so the precursor to things like the Big Bang Theory, and in general, trying to understand this world around us. This continued in a lot of different fashions for really many centuries, up through roughly the 15th century, where we start to see this divide beginning to happen that today seems commonplace, where we associate the humanities as being something different from the sciences, was really, I would date it back to roughly about the time of Galileo, so 16th century. Galileo was starting to formalize how he looked at the world using what today we identify as this hypothetical deductive model, kind of just a fancy way of saying starting with forming some hypotheses and then testing those, using experimentation. This sort of process ends up being formalized again in the late 16th century, early 17th century by Renee Descartes, who today we identify primarily with being a philosopher, but he was as much a mathematician as he was a philosopher. Because again, we were just starting to divide these as if they were separate things. Where it really starts to take root and we start to really see these as two almost divergent disciplines is around the 19th century. And that's where we start seeing more of the terminology and the phrasing being developed, even the term science. And now by the 20th and 21st century, it has become highly specialized that even regardless of which side of the house we're looking at, the science or the humanities side, both sides have become highly specialized. So it's unusual now to identify ourselves with simply being a scientist. It's what kind of scientist are you? Well, a natural scientist. Okay, well, what kind of natural scientist? Oh, I'm a biologist, but what kind of biologist? And we just keep getting more and more kind of specialized, detail oriented. And what this really leads to is quite often a disconnect between the hyper-focused, detailed areas now that are being studied. And again, the same thing's happening on the humanities side, where we tend to have these really small tracks at time that we're looking at, but it ends up creating a disconnect between that highly specialized research and how it applies to people, the human being. So really our focus tonight is going to be exploring maybe creative, innovative ways to reconnect the data and the scientific lessons that we derive from that data with the humanities side of the house, so with the human being. And a lot of this is in a way going to be somewhat returning us back to the roots of the history of both of these disciplines, that they really are much more alike in many ways than we tend to give them credit for nowadays. So before diving into some particular examples or how to approach this, if we want to try to, in a way, reconnect the value of the natural sciences with the value of the humanities, let me first get a bit of a sense as to who we have tonight. Because again, I really would rather have this more of an interactive workshop approach than just a talk. So I'm really looking to try to make it as relevant as possible to your particular areas. So if you would, in the chat, why don't you share with us, like, in a word or two, your background? Like, are you on the natural science or the humanities side of the house? Are you a botanist, a chemist, or, like, what is your background? And what brought you here tonight? Like, what are you hoping to get out of this workshop? And I'm going to ask for Mark's help here a little bit, because as I'm sharing screen, I can't always see the chat well.
Yeah, and I would just ask everyone to change the 2 in the chat to everyone, just so we can all start to get to know one another. So don't just send it to Maria or me, but to everyone.
As you're posting those, I'll give you a real quick background on my approach to this. Is I am an applied philosopher, so I'm in particular an applied ethicist, but my particular areas of interest are this Greek concept of eudaimonia, so living full and flourishing lives, and how place and the importance that place, both natural and synthetic places, play in our kind of quests for living those full and flourishing lives. So I like to look at a lot of the positive psychology data, and that's some on the scientific side of the house. What I use is quite often out of the social sciences.
Nice. So Maria, we've got some naturalist educators in the meeting, wildlife ecologists, avian ecologists. A lot are future presenters in the series. So I think we'll be able to really utilize what we learn and explore with you tonight further on in the series. An entomologist, especially native bees. Again, this person's giving a talk for the series in June.
I'm looking forward to attending some of the pollinating talks.
Yeah, me too. Someone's interested in the methods of teaching that aren't limited to separate disciplines. Yeah, a lot of folks that are actively engaged in conservation, folks that want to be better science communicators. I think kind of going at it from a different angle, beyond their expertise, and trying to maybe address other learning modalities and ways to get to the same end point.
Okay. And then let me, and continue to post in there if you haven't had your posting in the chat yet, but I'm going to move on here. A lot of what I'm hearing there, this is going to directly apply with, I even made a note here about some innovative ways of teaching the material as well. That's another area that I've spent about a decade looking at these multidisciplinary, not interdisciplinary, but multidiscipline, where the disciplines still stand alone, but we are able to highlight and spotlight the value that each of these independent disciplines bring to one topic as we're teaching it. So we can talk a little bit about that tonight as well, as we have time. So let's take a look at connecting the data with what I would call our stories. That's really the humanities side. If you think about it, the true value of data is not really in the data itself. I mean, if all we have are numbers on a page, it's going to be very difficult to get people interested in that. That the real value in the data is the story that the data is telling. And I would say, even furthermore, being an applied ethicist myself, the action that the data can empower us to take. But in order for data to drive action, first, I have to understand the story behind the data. And so that is where I would recommend, as researchers and presenters and teachers, that as we're trying to share our research and various data points with, especially with more of a general public, it's very important that we don't bypass that step of sharing the story behind the data. And what I would argue, ultimately engaging them into telling their own stories about the data. And we'll get to that a little bit later on here. So here's a very simplistic process that if you're looking at this and coming at it cold and just not sure where to get started, these are the really fundamental questions as a humanities person that I would recommend you start with. As is the case, anytime we're presenting anything, whether it's data or anything else, we have to know who our target audience is. So the first question, as I'm considering how to present, especially if it ends up being a lot of statistical type data, and I know I'm presenting this to a target audience that is not necessarily lit up by just the data. I mean, there's a small group of us that just get excited by the data itself, but most people, they want to know how it's going to impact them. And so the first question I always try to ask is, who's really impacted by this data? Now, that's a very general question to ask, that quite often we're going to have to drill down a little further, because different people will be impacted differently depending upon what that area is that we're collecting the data on. But at least start there, who's being impacted by this data? And then, of course, the immediate follow-up question, how are they being impacted? So in other words, who's impacted and why should they care? I know I'm engaging in these particular areas. For example, maybe I'm collecting data around bees because I literally get lit up as a pollinator. This is the area that I'm passionate about. But that doesn't necessarily mean that other individuals who are directly impacted, as we all are, by bees and their behaviors and so forth, they may not have that natural passion about it because they may not understand the story behind it. So this, why should they care about the data? I find is like at the core of the fundamental question we as researchers have to ask ourselves. And so the relevance that this data may bring, again, could vary even for one audience or one set of students that I'm presenting a lesson for. And if the more that I can take into account these various areas of impact, like how different people are going to be impacted differently, then the richer the actual presentation becomes. So I've asked who's being impacted, why they should care about this. So in general, how they're being impacted. Here's one approach. Now, it's not the only approach, but this is the one I tend to use when I'm working in multidisciplinary collaborative type settings. So if I'm, let's say, one of a few or maybe the only humanities person at the table, and all the other individuals I'm collaborating with are from various fields of science, and it may be natural sciences, maybe social sciences, a nice common place for us to start when we ask that question, why should my target audience care? So why should the people that are impacted care about the data we're attempting to share? I like to go back to the determinants of health that the World Health Organization outlines these, but they've also been framed in several different ways and modified in different ways by other organizations. But I like to go back to the World Health Organization's determinants of health, because when we think about general well-being, this impacts everyone. These are like common variables that every human being at some level cares about, even if they're not aware of it or conscious of it in the moment. So when you look at some of these various determinants of health, physical well-being, emotional well-being, economic well-being, occupational, when it comes to our work life, that work-life balance, social well-being, our connection with others, in general, life satisfaction. People want to be happy. What does that mean? And how does that vary, from one individual to another and from one group to another? Spiritual well-being. Now, again, I would not try to tackle all of these by any means in a single presentation. In fact, quite often I would pick just one, maybe two, but you want to keep it simple so that they, as you're telling the story, they can really identify with that track that's being laid out. So if I really want to focus on, let's say, physical well-being, that physical element, then I might talk a little bit about emotional or maybe intellectual, but I would try to stick pretty solid to physical and not start tossing in things like occupational and social, unless I have a pretty long time or an extended period of time with the same audience. Maybe they're coming back to a host series. It's an ongoing class that I can build upon. But if this is just like a one-shot deal where they're going to be here for 45 minutes or an hour, I would just select one of these. And then with that in mind, now I start to think about how I'm going to present this data. I know the what. I know what the data is. I know my focus. Let's say I'm going to use physical well-being. But now, how can I present the data in a way that they're going to not only connect with it, but remember it after the fact, that they're going to find some deep meaning with the data that I'm sharing? And so there's a lot of, especially with our technological age now, there are all kinds of tools out there, bells and whistles, I like to call them, that can make the data glitter and shine. Here, every individual kind of has to find what I consider to be their sweet spot. We can overdo the bells and whistles. And if we get too flashy in how we're presenting the data can actually be lost in the presentation. But if we don't put enough flash out there, then it becomes too dry and we lose our audience because they're not really paying attention. They're starting to gloss over because it is just numbers on a piece of paper at that point or on a screen. So again, as I think about how to present the data in a meaningful way, it's really becoming familiar with and remaining current on what sort of platforms are out there. So what are my options? And then deciding which of those platforms is really the best way to get this story across through my data. You know, which one matches the story I'm trying to tell? And again, not necessarily using something just because it's the shiniest or the latest, but the one that's going to tell my story in the most memorable way. So here are some factors to consider, I guess, as we're trying to decide what's the most meaningful way to present our data. One of the most basic things to keep in mind is this show, don't tell idea. And again, probably most people here are already familiar with this, but numbers on a page is not going to be memorable for individuals. The human brain tends to process images, pictures, maps, photos 60,000 times faster than the average person's brain does with text. So I'm going to use an example here for the next several factors. And I'm kind of drawing from my childhood hometown. I'm originally from Pennsylvania, and I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, a little town called St. Mary's. And St. Mary's is located in Elk County. Again, we earned that title, Elk County. This is one of the areas in Pennsylvania where elk tend to thrive. That wasn't always the case. As we know, elk had disappeared for a while across the United States. They were re-entered into Pennsylvania, as they were several other states. But the elk didn't survive in a lot of portions of Pennsylvania. For some reason, in Elk County and its neighboring county, Cameron County, they flourished. Now, back in, let's say this would be, I'm going to date myself a little bit, but when I was in high school, so we're talking the 80s now, 1980s, I can remember there was a real push in Elk County. It was largely being driven by the Pennsylvania Game Commissioner to get individuals interested in the data that was surrounding elk. And part of it is they wanted to have enough funding to follow the elk. They weren't really sure how many elk were surviving. They also were not sure why they were thriving in certain parts of Pennsylvania and not other parts. So they wanted to conduct more research around the elk. But for the most part, the local residents didn't care. And it was really difficult to get the local residents interested in this data about elk. So I'm going to take one example here. Now, this is the data I have listed here is coming from 1982, and this is how many elk were harvested that year. And I'll talk a little bit about why they're focused on harvesting the elk. But really what we have here is a list of towns and how many elk were literally harvested from those regions, so killed in those regions. Now, if I just look at this list, I'm probably not going to remember this. It's probably not even going to be very impactful unless maybe one of these, let's say I live in Clearfield, then maybe I focus in on Clearfield because I have a natural affinity there. But that's leaving a lot of the reliance on your audience member to make the connection rather than us as the researchers facilitating those connections. So something very simple is how we present the information. Notice by putting it onto a map, even if I'm not really familiar with Elk County or Cameron County in Pennsylvania, this starts to draw a picture for me that's going to be much more memorable than just that list of town names with numbers. But even with this map, again, it hits my brain in a more favorable way because my brain likes to see these photos and pictures, but it doesn't really tell the story. I mean, it's still just pin marks with numbers on them. I'm drawn to certain colors. I'm drawn to a little higher numbers here because they're in a yellow color, but I don't know why those numbers are higher. I don't know the story behind it. Now, if I'm presenting this data and I want, let's say I'm presenting it to some local residents in several of these towns. And I want them to understand the relevance of this data for their region. Well, now this is where I want to tell the story behind the data. What makes this something that's worth them connecting with? Well, why was the Pennsylvania Game Commissioner and a lot of the wildlife organizations, why were they so interested in how many elk were being harvested, how many elk were being killed in these regions? And the reason they were interested is between 1973 and 1981, so right before the data comes out, the elk herds had more than doubled in size just in these counties. So if we looked at Elk County, they had 38 elk that they were aware of. Now, again, there may have been others, but the ones they were aware of were 38 in 1972. And then between 1973 and 1981, that jumped to 135. Now, again, they wanted the elk to thrive. So on its face, that might sound like a good thing. The problem was, now that we had the elk more plentiful, they were getting into the farmers' crops. So they were destroying crops, which was having a direct impact on the food supply in these regions. Now, suddenly, as we start talking about food supply, remember my element of physical well-being, now I have something that everybody in the room has a way to connect with. This is something that's going to matter to every resident sitting there. And it's going to have an even heightened relevance to the farmers whose crops are being damaged that are sitting in the room. So as I think about how to display the data, I don't want to get caught up with just the bells and whistles that without telling the story, because now it may look prettier, they may identify with it in the moment quicker, but it's not going to stick with them like a story would. I'm going to build on this a little bit more on the story side of it. But before I do, let's start capturing in the chat, because for people who may not be familiar with the various tools that can be used to capture data in different ways, like tools that easily will create maps for you, or tools that will create charts for you very easily, and so forth. Why don't you post in the chat some of your favorite ways to create your charts, your maps, and so forth. And again, for those that may not have done any of this, Microsoft Word and that has a lot of it built right in as well. That makes it pretty simplistic to turn things into charts and maps. But as you're posting that, some other things I'll just toss out there that maybe you haven't thought about as much as like the pie charts and the bar graphs. Those tend to be a lot of the go-to ways that we're visualizing our data now, or even maps. The other things to keep in mind is sometimes even creating, especially if the audience is a little younger, is gaming, the various gaming platforms. If we present the data in the form of a game, that tends to engage people quite a bit too, and they'll remember. And then some other platforms, like if you're familiar with Padlet, you can create timelines and things with Padlet. I've even seen some data presented through using like Pinterest. So sometimes it's using the media sites that are out there, but in ways that perhaps they're not commonly thought about using them. Especially, again, if we're talking about our tech savvy generations that are already on those platforms. If we go where they already are, it's easier to get them to connect with our data. So Mark, do we have some things posted in the chat?
Yeah, and I just want to kind of build off what you said about the gaming. And as in a past life, I was an environmental educator, and one of the things that we tried to talk about was the water cycle. And you can draw it out to like try to understand it, but we found that it was even more effective to make it a game where the participant rolled a dice and then they moved from rain to runoff to like to a plant, to an animal, to a plant again, and they were able to live as a water droplet moving through that that system, just based on chance and the probabilities of being stored in the ocean. If you got stuck in the ocean, you were going to be there for a while. But yeah, in the chat we've got from the top, the usual charts from Excel. Love the engaging the audience through the polling feature of Zoom, which actually shows the results. And we've used that, I think, in the last talk to see how people are reacting. Somebody says Canva, but doesn't offer any other description. I'm not really sure what that one is. I'll have to look that up.
Canva or
Canva, like canvas?
Canva, if I'm thinking of the same one, that's a design site. And if I'm incorrect, whoever posted that can correct me on it. But yeah, Canva, you can do some pretty creative designs using Canva.
Yeah. And somebody else is making experiences maps. Another person says, for maps, I use aerial photo or LiDAR image next to a topographic map. Sometimes the use of a really old map next to LiDAR is effective for telling this person's story. And somebody else says the UNH does really great story maps. And that Indigenous NH site that I shared at the very beginning is actually a story map to be able to allow the user to zoom around and really experience that story. And finally, I like using great photos of wildlife or people, then telling the story over the images. So yeah, going to the point you made, Maria, that you show them and then kind of fill in those stories. Somebody says short video clips, 5 seconds, are effective for them telling their story. And again, stories through photography.
Yeah, I can see it through the photography and videos because it breathes life into it again. It makes it real. And another one is we were talking about the gaming aspect. GeoGuessr really is this game where you try to guess its location or place-based. So it'll show you a picture and you have to try to guess in so many guesses where it's located. But we have used that, especially with some of the younger school-age kids when we're talking about climate change, because we'll let them play the GeoGuessr. So you don't always have to build your entire lesson or data into the platform. Sometimes the platform can be off on the side. So we would use GeoGuessr, and then once they guess the location, based on that location, like say it was Puerto Rico, then we could talk about climate change in that region. And so it kind of tied the two together, but it was aligning them rather than trying to go in and embed something into another platform. So again, I'm one that doesn't like to get too bogged down in the technological side where it seems like technology tends to always act up at the least opportune times. But there are ways around that where we can kind of align them as well. We will capture this chat and send it out to all of you. So that's part of the reason why I'm having you put them into the chat so that later we can come back and go through some of these sites. All right, so we now have some like cool platforms and ways of putting our data out there. And some of the chat responses already touched on this, but the next important part is really to share the story, to not forget to actually share the story behind the data, which quite often is in part what is making us as the researcher passionate about collecting this data. So let me continue on with the story on the data that I've been working off of, this 1982 harvesting of the elk. As I mentioned, the elk herd had spiked in this period between 73 and 81. And because of the crop damage that was occurring, the Pennsylvania Game Commissioner became very concerned and they wanted to manage the elk in a more responsible way rather than just kind of opening it up. And so the initial proposal was to hold a lottery for an elk hunt where they would basically draw names and have 30 individuals granted a permit to hunt an elk. And they were, again, there were a lot of details to this, like whether you could take a bull elk or whether it had to be the female size, number of points, all of that. But what they were really looking at was to remove 30 elk from the population. And they really anticipated this being received positively because it had been more than half a century since elk were permitted to legally be hunted in Pennsylvania. They had been protecting them. And so the proposed elk hunt, as appealing as it was to some hunters throughout the state, if we stay focused on Elk County, and this was true of Cameron County as well, even the hunters in Elk and Cameron County, they weren't in favor of this elk lottery. And it was interesting because this is something that the game commissioner didn't see coming at the time. Some of the farmers and the residents were upset by the suggestion that outsiders, even though they were still from Pennsylvania, they saw them as outsiders coming in and taking their elk. So someone from out of the area would kill the elk. So what happened in practice is many of the local residents took the matters into their own hands. During 1982, 15 elk were shot illegally. 11 more elk were killed while they were causing crop damage. A lot of the farmers just went out and killed the elk. And these are same farmers who really abided by the law and protecting the elk prior to this lottery being proposed. And when it was all combined, the mortality in 1982 of elk hit a record high, the highest it had literally for over half a century. 38 elk had been killed that year. And so at this point now, the need for the lottery to have the hunt was no longer a need. It was considered that the surplus or the expendable elk that the game commissioner had identified had already been removed through the illegal shootings and through the farmer shooting the ones that were damaging their crops. So notice now, as you hear the story behind it, it starts to come alive. These numbers that originally were just a list, and even now on my map, it's no longer just a number. I start focusing in that 38 has a whole story behind it now. It's starting to take shape, take form. How can I play off of that, build off of that connection, that initial connection now, so that I can move this data from just connecting with individuals to perhaps decision-making and promoting some sort of action. First step is, again, tying it to what I consider to be high impact problems. So problems that most people are going to relate to. These are going to be major concerns, usually during a time period, but also with the majority of human beings. Can be things like poverty or inequalities or hunger. I mean, kind of those big areas. So what we were playing off of with this particular data was obviously the hunger issue and crop damage. So the proposed lottery hunt was a response to really the increasing crop damage that was being caused by this spike in the elk herds. So how does the data then drive decision making? What was happening in the early now to mid 1980s is people were starting to pay attention as they were hearing the stories. And again, now I'm going to drill down to my childhood hometown of St. Mary's, because this was actually when it was originally talking about this particular data set. This was a talk that was happening at my high school, okay, while I was there. So when we look at, okay, how does this data now just drive decision making? You know, there are consequences to the data. The data lives. It's not just stale numbers plastered somewhere, but it's actually causing us to make decisions and changes perhaps in how we live. So how did this make some decision or instigate some decision making? The elk crop damage around St. Mary's really didn't dissipate with the loss of these 38 elk, even though it was the highest number of elk that had been removed in a single year for over a half a century. It really didn't solve the problem. In fact, it didn't seem to even impact the crop damage problem. So immediately you had local residents as well as the game commissioner and other wildlife organizations saying, we need something else. The lottery hunt isn't the solution. Something else has to be tried. And so what happened is the Pennsylvania Game Commission and the Department of Environmental Resources Bureau of Forestry developed a new cooperative elk management plan. And this was implemented, it was kind of early to mid 1982. It actually immediately followed as they realized how many animals had been taken and that it wasn't really having the impact that they thought it would have on the crop damage. The plan was the first to establish the state's, it was the first Pennsylvania state anyway, elk management objectives. And so they sought to improve the habitats for the elk on public lands and render technical assistance to landowners who frequently were troubled by the elk. So it wasn't just the farmers and their crops, but the elk were also getting into a lot of people's backyards. This tends to continue to be a problem in the Benezet area and Bennett's Valley, which is a couple neighboring towns to St. Mary's. So what they looked at is rather than relying on once a year having a lottery for a hunt, perhaps the better approach is we have a lot of protected state game land in Pennsylvania, which again made it very easy for the Game Commission and the Department of Environmental Resources, the Forest Bureau. They had control over these lands already, that perhaps using those resources could actually have a greater impact on what was our high impact problem of affecting our food supply. So now, as we're sharing this story with our target audience, we've told the basic story of what happened. They're now seeing how there are consequences following from the actions that occurred. The next thing that really is what I consider to be the home run, bringing it home, is to now engage your audience in telling their own stories. It's sort of like, and every teacher knows this, if you can get your students to teach the lesson, then you know they really understand the lesson. If you can get your audience to start identifying with the data on such a level that they're telling their own stories using the data and how it relates to their own personal stories, now you know you've connected the data to the people that are most impacted. So how we know that this did occur with the data around elk herding is later that year, it was like November of 1982, an elk committee was formed that was comprised of the Game Commissioner, the Bureau of Forestry, several officials from the Bureau of Forestry, but they also brought on local farmers, some local hunters and sportsmen. And so you now had this committee that its purpose was to address elk-related problems and serve as really the conduit between the managers of the state game lands and the residents that are living near these lands. But notice what's happened in this new coalition that was formed is you now had the wildlife management officials sitting at the same table with the local residents. That at that point, what you realized is everyone around the table understood the value and the importance of the data. And we saw an immediate return in the support that local residents provided when there were additional studies or researchers coming into the area, or even photographers and wildlife enthusiasts. There was a different mentality around that now when the local residents could see the value of the products coming from those research efforts. It was no longer merely viewed as, oh, outsiders coming into our territory. So this territorialism, now it was a shared story and this feeling of connection where people were working together. And again, that all started with some numbers on a list on a piece of paper. And so if we can really tease out those stories, then the data comes alive. So at this point, I think it would be really valuable to give all of you some time to really drill down and try some similar exercises with your own either data or lessons, research, depending upon where you're coming from with this connection between the sciences and the humanities. What we're going to do is put you into breakout rooms. I will keep them kind of small, 4 to 5 people in a room so that everybody can really get involved. And what I would challenge you to do over, let's take about 10 minutes. We can always give you a little longer if you need it, but we'll give you a kind of a heads up when 10 minutes are up. Share with the others in the group kind of what your area is. If you're a researcher, if you collect data, what do you typically present on or teach on? And see if your group can select one of your areas of data, or a lesson that you present. And let's work through that one piece of data or that one lesson. Select an aspect of well-being, and I'll put those in the chat just so you can easily pull them that the World Health Organization uses. But select one of those aspects, whether it's economical well-being or mental well-being. Pick a focus and then discuss as a group how you could take your data or your lesson through that particular focus and present it in a meaningful way. And we'll come back and share those with all the other groups as well, so we can see what some of these ideas are on how to approach the data in a meaningful way. Are there any questions before we send you into breakout rooms as to what you're doing in your breakout room?
Mostly population trends.
You said that. We got some more people.
Hey, Lori.
Hi, whoever said that.
It was Pam.
Hi, Sally. How are you? It wasn't Sally. Who was it? Right. Hey,
It was
David.
Pam.
Oh, hey, Pam. There's just like too many faces. Yeah. David, you're still on the
Hello, Michael.
I still am, yes.
I know like half the people here. It's kind of funny.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it when all the cameras start coming on and we can actually see who's there.
I apologize. We have really bad connectivity, so I'm never on camera on Zoom.
I think that's everyone, Maria. We're all
Everyone back? Okay.
We
So
lost.
let's take some time. And I popped in. My plan was to pop into several breakout rooms, and I made it into one because I got pulled into the conversation, which tends to happen. That when we start talking about these connections between what we're actually doing and how it impacts both the sciences and the humanities, I have yet to find one of those conversations that's not interesting. So time can fly by. But let's share out a little bit what you were talking about, like what area, or if you were having trouble coming up with, I'm not really sure how this applies to me, share with us a little bit about what you do. And as a group, I think we can all kind of add some ideas in there on some different avenues that we could take. And one that in the group I was in, that we had started talking about grants, and that one thing I had not mentioned, I really did want to mention tonight, is if you tend to look for funding on the science side of the house and you've kind of got all your go-to sources for science funding, if you start collaborating with the humanities folks, we've got all our sources too. And this is something that has worked great for Diane, Mark, and I, as we kind of pooled together on this. It suddenly opens up, it literally doubles all the sources of funding you can go after. And that's the kind of the more popular grants now, is a lot of the grant writers want to see that collaboration across the sciences and the humanities. So if you're having difficulty landing your grants, what I would recommend is get somebody from the other side of the house and partner up. And quite often it'll put you to the top of the stack. But with that little plug, let me turn it over. Anyone want to share what you were talking about in your groups? Or if you had questions on something that we might be able to help you with?
Okay, I'll say something. So I'm one of the, she was in our group, she just joined us and she didn't get out. So anyway, I'm a funder. So I'm always looking for the what I call the long game in conservation. And it's true that there's a tendency now to, really combine the needs of people with the needs of nature. And I work in the global conservation. So I'm very, very involved with indigenous people, for example. And, but all of the projects we fund, they absolutely must be not just acceptable to the local community, but they need to be embraced by the local community. And that means the health, education, and welfare of those people. And so we just have to listen to them and see what it is that they want for their children. And I'm just going to say that everything is much more holistic now. It's not about trying to get things for some specific thing. It's about trying to see the big picture.
And I'll build on that a little bit at the college level. Do I have any other college professors here tonight? Okay, so I can tell you from the university and college level, higher education right now is undergoing a huge transition. But part of that transition is building on what Scott was just saying. We're actually doing away with a lot of what were traditional disciplines for years, and not just at Plymouth State University or University of New Hampshire. Around the world, this is happening. And they're starting to create new disciplines that are really the combination of these traditional disciplines, but they're framing them in new ways now. And so you might have a degree now in like climate change that's really a science and a humanities degree. It's combining the two together. And I think you're going to see more and more of that at the educational level too, in higher ed. Others want to share what you were discussing, or if you have an area that you'd like some input on. This part of the workshop's all for you.
I have a question. I'm wondering how you measure results in those situations, both in Scott's case and what you were just mentioning, Maria, so that if we're looking to have a marriage of science and humanities, then are the outlooks more wildlife driven, or are they more human driven, or are we or how are they connected?
To a large extent, it's shifting the mindset on even thinking about it that way. Is it more human driven or is it more nature driven? I've seen it on the assessment side. I've seen it arise in two ways. One where one can take almost like a priority over the other. So like maybe the human-based learning outcomes, or if it's a funding grant outcomes, or however you're defining those outcomes, are being used as the precursor to how it's going to impact the natural environment. So in other words, the human elements are in there, but they're feeding into this larger outcome of what I would consider to be the science side of the house. But then I've seen the flip side too, where the data is actually being used almost as the backdrop, and it's really the humanities connection that they're focused on. But how is this affecting the people? How is this really changing lives on the ground? And in that sense, when we assess both. I mean, your data has to still be accurate. There's still all the same methodologies and that in place on the scientific side of the house. It's more, how are we using this? Like, what's the end game? And what we're finding is rarely is the end game just gathering the data. And that's traditionally, we used to see that as the end game. And we're not seeing that anymore. If that makes sense. Like literally, I could, as my end game, produce the data, and then someone else would pick that up and run with it. Now what we're seeing is it's all happening in that same pod, so to speak. So I'm collecting that data, but I'm partnered up with the people who are actually using that data. So as it's presented, it ends up being presented out in this more holistic manner. It's not broken into, okay, the scientists are creating our data, now the humanities folks are going to grab that and show how it connects. You're not seeing that kind of chronological pattern happening. It's happening more holistically now.
Okay.
But I wouldn't say the methodology is drastically changing on how they're assessing.
My answer to you, Catherine, is that we have two sets of metrics. We have the metrics. Our primary metrics are conservation, achievements, and but we also have metrics for how many people we directly affect with employment and things like employment. Whether, for example, in Nepal where we work, generally speaking, women and girls have they have almost nothing. And, it's the lowest caste and all that kind of thing. And so getting girls into educational programs and giving women jobs is like one of our most important metrics for conservation success in Nepal.
Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else?
I can talk a little bit about what we discussed in our group. So we ended up, I'm a wildlife biologist with Maine Audubon, and we got talking about the data that we collect on our piping plovers and least terns that nest on the beaches in Maine. These are endangered and threatened species. And, we collect lots of data that has to do with how many pairs there were, how many nests there were, how many nests were successful, how many failed, how many chicks survived, how many chicks actually fledged, and that kind of thing. But one of our big challenges has to do with people walking their dogs on the beach. And there may be situations where it's very clearly posted for no dogs allowed, or other situations where they're allowed at certain times, or they have to be on leash. And many times people ignore that information or don't see the connection between why what they're doing matters to what the birds are doing and that kind of thing. So it wasn't so much a question of how do we present the data, because clearly the data is not going to resonate with people. So instead we talked more about what are some other methods that we could use to interact with folks that would help them appreciate how what they're doing with their dogs could impact these other birds and why they should care. And I don't know that we came up, the best idea, new idea we came up with, Mark suggested, he noted that, right in the moment, if you're finding somebody who's not following the rules, who wants to walk their dog anywhere, they're out there doing their physical thing, right? They're getting their exercise, they're getting their dog exercise. They don't want that to be interrupted. So that's not the best time to catch them. But maybe put flyers on their windshields. So when they go back to their car, you can give them some more information with some beautiful pictures, or maybe you catch them out on the beach and you point out one of those little cute little plover chicks so they actually can resonate with that. But it's an ongoing dilemma, and we certainly didn't solve it in 10 minutes.
I used to.
Marsha, or Mark, do you want to add anything to that?
Oh yeah, it's just about, unveiling the story of how that bird got there, which I don't think, once you can appreciate that it traveled thousands of miles on its own two wings, and, it's just trying to survive. I think that is how you win the hearts and minds of people to change behavior.
Yeah, I wanted to share, I used to live down near South Padre Island, and we had the brown pelican was struggling for a while. And similar sort of thing. People were walking their dogs and it would disturb a lot of their habitat. And I can tell you, one of the most successful little events or ventures that we had is we involved the 5th and 6th grade classes. They came up with the idea because one of the 5th graders had made the comment, well, why wouldn't they like the birds? They obviously like animals if they're walking dogs. And I thought, wow, that's an interesting insight. And so we ended up for like about a 2-month period on the weekends, these kids would go in groups. There would be 4 or 5 each weekend. And they would basically hang out where they knew that people were commonly walking the dogs before they would hit these habitats where the brown pelicans wanted to roost. And they would basically ask if they could pet the dog, or they'd interact with the person. And then after talking about how beautiful their dog is or how great the dog is, they would say, oh, well, why I'm here is because there's these really cool birds here too. And they were able to educate the dog walkers where we couldn't break that nut at all. Like the same thing, they were busy, they had their thing to do, they didn't want to hear it. Oh, you're another nature lover. They had all kinds of things, you know, but with the kids went right through it. And they got to them through their own pet. You know, so that's an idea too, is it kind of goes back to what Scott was starting to say though, is you got to kind of meet them where they're at. Like you've got to look at where the people are on the ground and what's important to them.
Yeah, and we did start a program a couple of years ago on that, with that same idea, but we didn't use kids. We created these pets for plovers handkerchiefs that dog walkers who also liked the plovers could put on their dogs so other people could see that, hey, I love my dog, but I also love the plovers and I'm going to be respectful of them. And we thought if we had enough people out there with these scarves on their dogs, then maybe that would catch on. It kind of worked. It didn't take off in the way that we were hoping it would.
That's a great idea though. I like that.
So having the kids involved, I think it would be, we've had kids do posters. We've had kids go in front of the town council and say, hey, we need to adopt the plovers as our town bird. So that those kinds of things have been helpful. Involving the kids definitely is helpful.
Oh, Sally, I'd love to connect with you after this. Since I was a kid, I've been going to the beach in Biddeford at Fortune's Rocks and Granite Point and everything, and Biddeford Pool. And there are lots of pairs of plovers there.
Yes.
And there's a long-standing history of people not paying attention to any of the signs regarding their dogs.
I know.
I'm one of the few people who actually leashes my dog on that beach. I would love to chat with you offline about that.
Great. All right.
I guess I'll just second the thing that was said about meeting them where they're at, because you know, I had 30 years of dealing with dog owners with piping plovers. So that idea that the intern walks up to the dog and is friendly to the dog first is absolutely a good idea.
Yeah.
Mm.
Now we're down to probably just a few minutes here, but do we have anyone else? Well, we talked out for the night. Okay, well, Mark, I think we can probably call it then.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us this evening for a really cool exploration into those connections between the sciences and humanities. And thank you, Maria, for leading us through that. That was really cool, eye-opening for me. And I'm really looking forward to the folks of you that are going to be presenting and working with you on this series with Diane and Maria. And in case you didn't know, I'm giving a talk on Tuesday in a part of this series with Becky Swamala and Diane DeLuca about community science. And then the next one I think is in a couple weeks, and we're really starting to gear up towards our pollinator focused talks. So feel free to register for any and all of the talks. Diane has come up with a great lineup of excellent speakers, you all included. So thanks for your time tonight, and look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Okay. Thanks for coming out, everybody.
Thank you.
Nice to see you.
Yep. See everybody that I know.
All right.